Good evening. This is Monica with the United Chinese Americans. We're just slowly letting people in, so give us 1 sec and we will begin shortly. Welcome to the second webinar of the UCA Town Hall series. This is the webinar. We're very lucky today to have two distinguished speakers from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, here with us to discuss the WeChat and TikTok ban, as well as some of the national security actions and policies that have taken place recently in their impact on the Chinese American community. Like I earlier said, this is the second webinar of our town hall series, and we're very happy to have some of you that are returning and have joined us for the first one as well. So hopefully you will continue to join us as we take on this series, and we certainly welcome your input as well as your suggestions on additional topics that you find relevant and interesting. But without further ado, let me turn over to Mr. Haipei Shue, President of UCA.
I thank you, Monica, for the introduction. Welcome everybody there. Good evening. This is as Monica said, this is our second national policy webinar. And this one is focused very much on the very issue that so many Chinese Americans have concerned about, and that is the continued use or ban of WeChat. Now, as you all have known, that the federal judge in San Francisco had just issued an injunction or a temporary injunction against that ban. And so, and we also know that the federal government is going to appeal. So that means the battle has just begun. It is not the end point yet by far. We are fully aware of there's some different contradictions in how to look at the freedom of speech from a Chinese angle from China and from American angle as the Chinese Americans in these countries. And we will let our distinguished lawyers from ACLU to help us sort that out. Just very quickly, I want to say one great word about ACLU. I don't think that many of you here need my introduction about these household organizations. Just suffice to say that this great organization has stood up for the American civil rights and the constitutional protections ever since the 1920s, starting from defending the infamous groups like American Communist Party to Jehovah's Witness for the religious objector of conscientious, and from in the 40s, from standing for the rights and fighting in the court for the rights of Japanese internment people to even today. And lastly, but not the least, at least to our community, I want to thank ACLU to also pick up the fight for the rights of Professor Xiaoxing in American court. Without further ado, I'll give it back to Monica. Thanks.
Thank you, Haipei. So our two speakers today are Ms. Hina Shamsi. Hina is the director of the National Security Project at ACLU. She is an expert regarding to human rights litigation, as well as civil liberties and freedom of speech issues. She's have a distinguished career, and we've listed more of her background on the UCA website, so I'll just keep it short here. Our second speaker today is Mr. Patrick Toomey. Patrick is a senior staff attorney also with the National Security Project, and he's written profusely on a lot of the national security issues, including surveillance and privacy issues. So I believe Patrick will talk a little more about that today. Next, let's turn over to our first speaker, Hina, and please, Hina will give a brief remark. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Monica. And I also have to thank Haipei for such a kind introduction to the ACLU. And also Professor Pei and Shirley Ma and Chang-Fu Chang, who are making this technologically possible. We are so honored to be here. We deeply appreciate the invitation to speak with UCA and your members. And the reason that we are here and the reason that the issues that we're talking about are so important to us is because we know how important the platforms, TikTok and particularly WeChat, are for the ability of Chinese American communities to exercise their constitutionally protected rights of freedom of speech and association and expression. Haipei kindly explained a little bit about the work of the ACLU. Those who may not be as familiar, as Haipei said, our work is to protect rights and liberties. We are not a foreign policy organization. So for example, in this context, we wouldn't opine on or talk about, US-China relationships, but what we do focus on is how our government and the actions that it takes have an impact on the rights of people in the United States and US people abroad. Patrick and I work in the National Security Project, which means that our particular focus is on US government policies and practices that are taken in the name of national security and abuse people's rights. And that brings us to this specific topic, because what President Trump did in invoking emergency powers in the name of national security to ban entire platforms is unprecedented. No other president has ever taken actions like these against platforms that tens of millions of people in the United States use. And we know, we've certainly been hearing and following the consequences of what these actions would be for users, especially of WeChat. We know this not just from broader communities, but also because we have Chinese American staff members who have personal experience of what the inability to use these platforms would mean for communications with family members in China, especially important for potentially newer immigrant communities. We also know that this has a specific impact on the elderly people, people who have come to understand and work on WeChat and rely on it as opposed to any other platform for connections, communities, and that becomes especially important as we are all so much more isolated in this pandemic, and these kinds of platforms and WeChat become so much more critical. Now, I'm going to talk about the First Amendment aspect and also questions that have been coming up about the reasons for implementation of these bans and the questions about validity and why this has happened. So, First Amendment, one of our most critical freedoms here, because it preserves is exactly the kind of connections that people in the United States have and make on WeChat. Not just the personal connections that I talked about, but also the ability to conduct important transactions and the harms to business and especially small businesses. Those are all protected by the First Amendment. And you will all have seen that the Commerce Department issued regulations that were more specific about the actions that are or will be banned with respect to WeChat. And I'll talk about the litigation in a bit as well. But the regulations are important for a number of I'm just going to unmute myself. They make clear that regular users will not be prosecuted for engaging in communications. And that's an important thing for people to know, because it was very uncertain, especially because the regime, the emergency regime, which is supposed to be exceptional, that President Trump invoked in order to issue these bans, can have draconian sanctions, civil and criminal sanctions for violations. But with respect to WeChat, the Commerce Department order or regulations serve as an effective ban on the platform. And I'll give you one example, which is that if the action isn't stopped by the court, then people won't be able to get software updates that can often protect against vulnerabilities and fix vulnerabilities and make these apps more secure. So as these apps become less secure or become degraded over time, or there are issues with the impact of not being able to conduct payments securely, then people will feel that they cannot use these apps, or they will put their own security in jeopardy if they use these apps. And so for us, it's very important to recognize that in implementing President Trump's abuse of emergency powers, Commerce Secretary Ross is essentially undermining rights as well as security. Another important thing that we think is very important when we're thinking about the reasons, I think, and we all think, it is very hard to separate out these particular actions against TikTok and WeChat from the fact that they are taking place in the context of President Trump's trade war with China, right? As well as the president's history of scapegoating China and Chinese Americans with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the president's history of anti-Chinese rhetoric and xenophobia. And that forms part of an important backdrop, because the government has identified essentially three concerns to which these bans purportedly respond. One is data collection, two is censorship, and three is disinformation. Now, when you look at the actual facts, these concerns are, to say the very, very least, overstated. Take data collection, for example. It is very true that WeChat, like TikTok, collects broad categories of their users' data, right? There are legitimate concerns about the sharing of that information with the Chinese government. But the administration has not provided, and this is very important because when the government takes action, especially actions that harm people's rights, they need to be put to the test, right? And they actually haven't provided specific and direct evidence of harm that rises to the level of something that would approach justification for such a pervasive ban. They've provided speculation, they've provided assertions, but the thing is that if we're talking about data collection, for example, then the kind of data that WeChat and TikTok collect with respect to US users isn't actually all that different from the kinds of data that foreign companies or even American companies like Google and Facebook collect. But the Trump administration has made no effort to address the privacy invasions caused by other companies operating in the United States. Nor has President Trump supported important surveillance reforms that would better protect our communications, sensitive data of both Americans, but also others, against warrantless surveillance and spying, including by US intelligence agencies. And we think that if protecting the information of users in the United States were a true motivating factor, the US government could do other things that would be more effective and rights protective instead of rights violating. For example, we think strong consumer privacy legislation would help here. And it would limit the kind of data that social media companies can collect in the first place. Surveillance reform would be important. There are privacy threats that come from various different kinds of categories, right? Security breaches, government surveillance, data collection, and those are the kinds of things that more targeted legislation or actions could actually address. But that's not what has happened here. Another thing is that unlike people in China, people in the United States have constitutional rights. So there are things that we recognize and people have raised that the Chinese government does that are repressive and abusive, creating a great firewall. That doesn't mean that the United States should join in a race to the bottom. And what is critically important is that rights be protected. Now, the WeChat User Alliance has filed an important and powerful suit, and Haipei referred to it earlier. I'm sure people are very aware of it. And for now, those plaintiffs and their lawyers have won a very important victory, because the court in California has issued, as Haipei said, a ban that prevents an order that prevents the ban from going into effect. It was critically important that the court identified the very serious First Amendment concerns that have been raised by the order. Those are the issues that are going also to be critical going forward, because again, as Haipei said, it seems pretty predictable that the government is going to appeal. It may ask for the court's injunction to be stayed while the appeals go forward. And there will be real concerns for people if that happens. And that's something that we are monitoring and care about very, very closely. I know my time is coming to a bit of an end, but those are some of the important things that I wanted to highlight to hopefully set a framework for follow-up questions that we're looking forward to, and also to pass over to my colleague Patrick to address related and other very, very important aspects that we're working on and care about.
Thank you, Hina. And so our next speaker is Patrick Toomey. Patrick, I think you are on, so please go ahead.
Great, thanks Monica, and thanks to everyone again for having us here. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be speaking with everyone tonight. So my remarks, at least for the next few minutes, are kind of gonna take a step back and talk about the broader context and the broader set of concerns that the ACLU has in an arena where national security is being invoked by the government to justify intruding on people's rights in a whole host of different ways. And so I want to talk a bit about what we've seen at the ACLU, the ways in which we've been engaged in trying to take on some of those challenges and to assist people of Chinese heritage in pushing back, and also to invite you ultimately and your family members, your community members, to reach out to the ACLU when your lives and rights are impacted by the government's actions. So this is just kind of an overview and an invitation to continue working together. So to set the stage, we at the ACLU, we have worked for many years, and we know that the government, the US government, has tried to go quite far, especially since 9/11, in targeting Black and Brown communities, often stretching or outright violating the legal limits on government power in the name of national security. And we also know at the same time that even long predating 9/11 and going back more than a century, there's a long strain of animus against the Chinese American community in this country. And many of those strains, in our view, are coming together in the present climate as the government essentially repurposes or adapts many of the powers and strategies that it developed after 9/11 to disproportionately scrutinize people of Chinese heritage in this country. And so I want to talk about some of the ways that we're seeing that. I'm sure my survey won't be exhaustive and won't even capture all the ways in which the ACLU is working on these issues. But I do want to note at the outset that the ACLU's concerns and its work to combat discrimination against people of Chinese heritage is not new. I was looking back through our archives recently, and I saw that long before I was at the ACLU, we filed an amicus brief in Dr. Wenho Lee's criminal prosecution in New Mexico. And one of the claims that he put forward in his case was a claim of selective prosecution, that he had been singled out and targeted because of his background, and that was one of the driving factors that led to the government's investigation and ultimately the prosecution, which fell apart. And the ACLU, together or alongside the Asian Law Caucus, both filed briefs in support of his effort to get more evidence of discrimination in that criminal prosecution. And so part of the reason that I'm here and that Hina is here tonight is because today we're very concerned to make sure that Chinese Americans are protected when they're exercising their constitutionally protected rights. We know that bigotry is on the rise in our country, and we're concerned about this racism and the xenophobia that people are experiencing. And if this has an impact on you, we want you to come away with the message that you should reach out to your ACLU affiliates. The ACLU has at least one office in every state in the country. And we work specifically on national security issues. So if the impact that this is having is tied to any of those concerns, or if that's the pretext that the government is invoking, we certainly want to hear from you and hope that you will reach out to the ACLU. So just to touch on some of the present day concerns about discrimination that we are watching and keeping an eye on. One of them is, as I'm sure many of you know or have experienced in your own ways, the wide-ranging investigations of scientists and researchers who have family or professional ties to China. And this by itself is not new. As many of you may have seen, Professor Andrew Kim has published a paper examining how disproportionate prosecutions have targeted people of Chinese ancestry and Asian ancestry going back years. But we are certainly seeing more of that. And we're also seeing a great deal of racially and ethnically biased rhetoric coming from top government officials, including, like, as Hina said, President Trump himself, but also the FBI director in describing elements of the so-called China Initiative, and the government's describing what government officials have called a society-wide effort to combat attempts to steal intellectual property from the United States. And I'm sure it comes as no surprise that we find those statements completely overbroad. And our fear, and I think what we believe we're seeing, is that those impulses have infiltrated the government's efforts to investigate scientists and researchers, and to enlist both the scientific agencies here in the US, the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, as well as individual academic institutions and scientific research institutions in investigating scientists. And what that has done is transform things that just a year or 2 years ago, or just in the past few years, would have been treated as administrative issues or at most private employment disputes, into situations where the government is considering criminal charges or is bringing criminal charges. And we've seen a number of those cases being brought in different parts of the country. We help represent Professor Xiaoxing Shi, who was who was prosecuted and had a great team of defense lawyers who helped persuade the government to drop that case. We're now co-counsel with a civil rights firm in Philadelphia, representing Professor Shue in a civil lawsuit that challenges both the very intrusive surveillance that he was subjected to, as well as the prosecution that was dropped. But his case is one example of how the government has targeted individuals, Chinese American scientists, and the ways in which those claims have not been borne out. And so there are other cases where we've seen the government adopting really novel legal theories or using very, very powerful national security surveillance tools to go after individuals in cases that, when they're ultimately prosecuted, have no apparent ties to national security, and instead involve claims related to wire fraud, or in the case of Professor Franklin Tao in Kansas, originally program fraud claims that were then revised multiple times as the government tried to adapt its legal theories to weaknesses in its own case. So we're seeing very, very unusual and overbroad theories in these types of cases. So that just touches on one area where we're seeing. I do want to quickly mention some of the ways in which we try to provide resources to help members of the Chinese American community when they're impacted. So one of the first ways in which we try to do that is with Know Your Rights materials that are available on the ACLU's website, that you can access by reaching out to ACLU affiliates. And those deal with situations that many people may encounter. People can be approached by the FBI and, invited to give a voluntary interview. And these materials address what your rights are in that type of situation, and lay out some of the things to consider if you're facing that type of invitation. Those materials also address common situations like crossing the border if you're engaged in international travel, and the government's efforts sometimes to exploit its powers at the border to either interview people or to conduct searches that it could not conduct, could not even attempt to conduct when people are inside the country. And so we want to make sure that everyone's aware that those materials are out there. Other ways in which we try to provide assistance are by co-counseling in civil cases that seek to vindicate people's rights and get some recompense for what individuals have suffered at the government's hands when their rights are violated. We sometimes will file amicus briefs, as we did in Dr. Wenho Lee's case. And we also work closely with people's lawyers, even if we're not formally involved in a representation, to try to provide some of our expertise or assistance. And at the same time, we engage in efforts around transparency and advocacy. So we have a request under the Freedom of Information Act, which is a law that allows the public to request government records, where we're seeking more information about the China Initiative and efforts to disproportionately scrutinize Chinese American scientists and researchers. And we also do our best to speak out when we are hearing from communities that they are impacted by the government's overstated invocations of national security powers. So those are some of the ways in which we're involved in this work. As I said, we would love to hear from any of you if there are other ways in which you're impacted or which we could help. But Monica, I think I'll turn it back to you, and we're happy to hear people's questions.
Thank you so much, Patrick and Hina. There's so much there to unpack. I know we just had a question about if you can, again, tell folks how can they get access to this information that you just mentioned. I think you said it's available on the ACLU's website.
Yes, that's exactly right. So if you search for Know Your Rights materials and ACLU, you'll find a host of a wide range of different materials, and most of those materials should be translated as well, if that's helpful to people in both simple Chinese and traditional Chinese. So our goal, at least, is to make these materials as accessible as possible to the people who need them.
And while I have you, on the podium there, you had earlier mentioned that there are individual state chapters of ACLU. Can you talk a little bit of the difference? And Hina, please jump in as well too. What is the difference between the national chapter? Because I think the national security project you guys are working on are more the national level. What is the difference between that level and also the local chapters? And at what time should folks, if they have questions or they want to get in touch with somebody, should they always reach out first to the local chapters?
Great question. So that's exactly right. The ACLU has a state affiliate or a state chapter in every state. We work in close coordination with our state affiliates. So often if you reach out to a state affiliate, I would typically view that as your first point of contact because they have familiarity with local communities and with local, if an issue is related to a state law or a particular, is tied to a particular community, they have that local expertise. But for certain specialized areas, including national security, we will work with the state affiliate to coordinate a response on topics that relate to those kind of overarching issues. So we in our national security project bring that particular expertise, but if we were to be involved in a case or to file an amicus brief, we would do it alongside the state affiliate. So reaching out to the state affiliate in the first instance is generally the best approach, but they will make sure to coordinate with the right element of the national organization.
And Patrick, can you just give a few examples of in what cases would someone should reach out to the ACLU, the state local chapters?
So there are a number of different ways. I think if someone, for instance, was approached by the FBI and wanted help being referred to a lawyer who might be able to help them, that would be one example. We wouldn't necessarily provide that representation ourselves, but we sometimes can act as a connector for people who need legal assistance. But another example is if people are experiencing discrimination, they work at a federal agency or a scientific research institution, and they believe they are being investigated or targeted or surveilled for discriminatory reasons. I think they could reach out in those circumstances, and we would do our best to get more information about what they're experiencing and then decide what the right approach would be. And Hina, yeah, if you want to jump in and add, you might have ideas as well.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add that I know we scheduled the webinar in part to account for people in the West Coast, and our West Coast affiliates, around the country, definitely, I'm never going to say, this one's my favorite or that one, I'd get into trouble, but our West Coast affiliates are really terrific and available and do very, very strong work, including with respect to discrimination against Chinese Americans and Asian Americans.
Great, thank you. And while I have you on the podium, Hina, I wanted to go back to the WeChat issue because, you had talked a little bit about, I really like your point about not a race to the bottom, right? And especially the fact that there are certainly potentially an overstated or overreach on the government's part and kind of claiming some of these concerns. My question is, while we're trying to assert our freedom of speech in terms of counteracting or objecting against this potential WeChat ban, how do we justify the fact that a lot of our community members definitely rely and depend on the use of WeChat, but many of them also are subject to censorship, as well as potentially even being banned themselves on the WeChat platform. So WeChat itself sometimes isn't necessarily a honest player. So how do we justify protecting, maintaining this access, this platform and this service when it itself is not respecting freedom of speech?
Yeah, so excellent question, and part of what all of us try and think about as we try and navigate the various different apps that we have access to, especially those of us from immigrant communities who are maintaining connections to family members abroad. I certainly face some similar issues with my family members who are abroad and living in countries where their governments are surveilling the apps themselves or can't fully use the apps. And, I think that part of it is the race to bottom response, Monica. The fact that another country, or in this instance, China, does bad things on a platform. And the thing we have to recognize is that the bad things that China does most are to its own citizens the most. And that certainly has ramifications and can have consequences for people in the United States. But as we're thinking about what should the response be, the response shouldn't be that the US turns around and does something similar or bans an entire platform. And here, what's really also important, which is not to minimize at all the experiences of people who feel like they have to self-censor or are subject to actions on a platform, is to recognize how broadly something like WeChat is important, right? Last time I looked, 19 million potential users in the United States. That's a lot of connections, a lot of relationships. And it's the nature of this action that is also so problematic, right? It's the nature of an action that would ban an entire platform for people. And so it's the consequence for real people's lives. It's an overly broad action, legitimate, and this is not, in some sense, President Trump takes things to the nth level in terms of rights violations. But in some sense, it is not such a new thing for the US government to take overly broad actions in the name of national security. The one here seems to us particularly pretextual, just given the context, but also because in taking this action, the president is preventing people from exercising their freedom of speech, expression, and association, right? If the platforms are degraded and become virtually effectively banned, then it is, put it another way, another extreme form of censorship, right? And tit for tat is not the way to go. So from our perspective, if the government wants to claim the high ground, including the moral high ground on freedom of expression and rights and association and assembly, then this is exactly the wrong action for it to take.
Your argument against tit for tat is really important, because I think there's also some concern that saying, well, isn't just this retaliation or reciprocity, right? Because a lot of the platforms that could have exist to facilitate communication cross-border, for example, like Gmail or Facebook, are not accessible in China. And so, if they're not accessible in China, then why make WeChat accessible? But you're saying that tit for tat, so just retaliation or reciprocity isn't really the right way to go.
That's right. And another thing that's really important as we think through this world of ours in which technology and the technology revolution and social media and platforms, in many ways we're all still thinking through what it looks like for speech to be regulated in this context, right? And what we're worried about is, well, many things, but here's at least a couple, which is, for many people, there is actually no alternative to WeChat, right? In terms of the ability to communicate with loved ones or conduct business in China. That matters. If the government wanted to take more targeted action to prevent harm from, Chinese government interests or those kinds of harms, say that the government did have a legitimate ground, which it hasn't really provided, but say it did, then our view is that this massive platform ban right? The effective ban, that's not the solution. There are other more targeted things that it can and should do that are not so massively and pervasively rights violating, and would also set a very bad precedent about what a government can do with respect to social media apps. So I think the short way of answering it is that the fact that China does something bad does not justify America doing something bad. And instead, when we're thinking about human rights and civil liberties, it matters to me that I can't talk to my family members fully and freely in the places that they are located, right? The fact that they are restricted does not mean that my rights here or the rights of anyone else here should be restricted in terms of our ability to engage in those communications and keep trying the ways that we all need to maintain life's essential connections.
So Hina, you also seem to refer to in your remark that there could be a better way at addressing some of the government's concern. I think a few things you mentioned, including, consumer privacy reform regulations or surveillance reform. Can you talk a little bit about that? So it seems like, some of the, even though they're alleged concerns, they could be, problematic. But if there's a better way at doing that while maintaining the platform, what could they be? And can you talk a little more about what those alternative solutions are?
Yes, and here, though, I also, Patrick's also an expert here, and so I want him to jump in and talk about some of the specific surveillance type reforms, as well as the tech kind of reforms and solutions and protections that we've been calling for or talking about. Patrick?
Sure. So there are solutions on both the consumer privacy side and the surveillance side, and they're not really entirely separate buckets because they're very closely related. And one of the problems with the bans is how kind of wildly under-inclusive they are. So take, for instance, the concern that either platform, WeChat or TikTok, is collecting and potentially could share location information about its users. There are hundreds of companies that collect, sell, repackage, correlate, and then resell the location information of people located in the United States. It is a very, very unregulated, poorly governed industry, and we're learning more about it all the time. But all kinds of entities can acquire that type of information. And so for the government to say we have to ban these apps because of that risk, when not only the Chinese government, but almost any commercial entity, any other government, including the US government, can buy that information. And we have learned through a number of news stories in the past few years, does buy that information, raises our concerns. So this one solution is to make sure that that data cannot be freely collected, in a way that potentially is unnecessary to a company's ordinary uses, but companies decide to buy and sell for an additional revenue, or that it can't be retained for as long, so that data, even if has a temporary purpose, business purpose, has to be deleted after a certain period of time. What this example goes to is the need for a broader consumer privacy set of protections that have the effect of limiting the amount of data that is out there, that we all leave behind, that companies can scoop up and use in ways that then governments have the opportunity to exploit. On the surveillance side, there's concern that similarly that governments either can buy this information or that they can collect it themselves. And there are ways to encourage companies to use stronger forms of protection that are not as susceptible to easy interception. And we saw a number of companies moving in that direction after the Snowden disclosures, when many companies adopted what's called HTTPS by default, which is a protocol for transmitting information more securely over the internet in ways that make surveillance more costly for governments. And that's one of the things that, as a net effect, can protect many people, because when intelligence agencies want to get access to the information, they have to work a lot harder to get any particular person's private data.
Thank you, Patrick. And Hina, I mean, I think definitely we should push for these better solutions, because I think it's important to address some of these concerns while being able to preserve this communication platform. But I do see a lot of questions on, you know, even if these reforms are ongoing, right? I think the community feels that there is some kind of undue targeting, right? That there's, as kind of what you alluded to earlier, that there's a feeling that the community, the Chinese American or the American, you know, of Chinese heritage community is being singled out and targeted. Do you have any suggestions, or, you know, can you comment a little bit about that? Is the freedom of speech argument, right? Preserving WeChat is one thing, but when your community might be kind of on the hook, you know, what are some ways to push back or to be conscious of your rights, especially when, you know, I feel like, you know, I think a lot of folks feel like that their every move is being monitored, you know, whether it is self-monitored or, you know, or some kind of a scrutiny system.
Yeah, it's such an important and good question again. Thank you. So, it's completely understandable that people think that this is the Chinese American community being singled out, right? And that also relates to part of what Patrick and I have been talking about, which is this is not an action that the government has taken with social media platforms that are so closely tied to any other community, any other country's social media platform. And that's part of why, you know, this is so unprecedented. It is these two platforms in the context of, and also surrounded by, the president's clear animus reflected in action as well as words with respect to Chinese American communities and the Chinese government. He goes back and forth on those two things, of course, but the reality also is borne out. So I think, you know, for people expressing that concern, we agree. That is a very, very real concern. And I think part of the response is, you know, the First Amendment is a means by which any targeted community, because in our country we have a very long history of disproportionately targeting our country's latest disfavored minority with respect to surveillance and investigation. It's a tool for not just guaranteeing rights, but when they're violated, to vindicate them. They're also, as the WeChat users lawsuit did, equal protection claims, right? And there's some relationship between the First Amendment and equal protection, because at the core, what we're talking about is an action that is discriminatory with respect to who it disproportionately targets or has disproportionate consequences for. And so for us, it's very important to do things like this, which is to be in conversation with and talking to organizations like UCA, working with and representing particular communities, and urging people to, you know, there are courageous people like the plaintiffs in the WeChat Users Alliance litigation. There are courageous people like Professor Xi, who Patrick and our other colleagues represent, you know, to stand up for when rights are harmed, but also to be in touch with your representatives, members of Congress, because there are systemic reforms that we need to vindicate these rights. So among the things that we're pressing in addition to, you know, safeguarding rights, is we need a massive overhaul of the emergency powers regime that President Trump and others before him, but also especially President Trump, has abused far beyond what Congress originally intended, in order to take And I see these kinds of things as interconnected. This particular action with respect to WeChat has massive and disproportionate impacts focused on Chinese American communities. He's also used the emergency power to construct the border wall, which is a xenophobic and racist sort of endeavor and has harmed border communities as well as our environment. And so in the long term, or hopefully not so long term, that's the kind of systemic overhaul that we want to see, and we would love for people to know and understand and support so that abuses like this can't happen, because it is very, very important for us and others to bring the lawsuits and vindicate people's rights. We're not going to stop doing that. We're going to continue doing that, but we also need systemic structural change to prevent these kinds of abuses from happening again in the future.
Thank you,
Patrick, do you want to add to anything?
Just let me summarize quickly. So we've discussed both some alternative solutions that could potentially help address government's concern and even perhaps even make WeChat a better platform while preserving this platform so that folks can still continue to use it. Patrick, I will let you weigh in a sec, but we do have several more questions with very little time. So I wanted to quickly, just maybe 20-second remarks from each of you. We have a very specific question, the fact that I think one of you alluded to there is currently an injunction, but I think the government has said that they're going to challenge, right? They're going to appeal. Is the ACLU planning to weigh in on that situation? And what do you think will happen if the government, in terms of next step, if the government wins the appeal, how will this play out?
Yeah. So let me just say at this point, this is pretty fast moving. We've been tracking it very closely right from its inception. We've been trying to figure out or think through our best approach to stand up for people's rights and to support people standing up for their rights. And that's part of our job, and that's part of what we're doing. You can continue to expect to hear more from us on this particular issue. I think the one thing I can predict at this point is that litigation is going to continue, and that the government is not going to back down with respect to WeChat in terms of litigation.
Patrick, any closing thoughts from you? And then also, we have a question on how can folks join the ACLU, or what can folks do to help support the organization? Both Patrick and Hina, please.
Sure. I'll just say on that point that we're a membership organization, so we draw the lifeblood of our organization from our members, and we're lucky to have many supporters around the country, but we always are looking to expand our community of supporters. So people can can become, what they say, a card-carrying member of the ACLU through our website. But even alongside that, whether or not you're a member, we want to speak to people, and so we invite you to visit our website to look at all the work that we're doing, to follow us on Twitter, and just to let us know how you're impacted. What are the ways in which we can support the civil rights and civil liberties of people who are part of UCA and their families and their community. So that's how we draw support from all of you.
Thank you. And Hina, closing remarks from you?
Well, Patrick said it all so well. The only thing that I would add is just to repeat that the fact that you invited us to speak with your members and to get to know UCA better, because we obviously knew of you, but we didn't get to know you better. This is an honor for us, and we really appreciate it. We wish you the best for the strength of your work, and we look forward to being able to continue working together.
Thank you so much, Hina and Patrick. And there was so much discussed and raised here today. I mean, it's unfortunate we couldn't have more time to flesh them out. So certainly, I hope it's all right for me to say we would love to welcome you back, maybe for another webinar, so we can dive into some of these more issues. And certainly, I think we would all benefit more from hearing from you as well. So thank you again. And before I turn it over to closing remarks from Haipei, I just want to say thank you for all our listeners and attendees today for your participation. And we unfortunately couldn't get to all of the questions, but we did put UCA's email address in the chat room. So if you want to go ahead and email any additional or follow-up questions to us, we will make sure that those get to our speakers and we will respond. So if you want to email, I think the information is info@ucausa.org. And we will also look through the chat room, and if there are questions that we did not get to, we will try to reach back out to you as well. So please don't think this is the end of the conversation. And certainly, as Hina said, looks like this lawsuit is going to continue. So it is to be decided, and there's still a lot waiting and writing on this. So certainly this is just the beginning and part of the conversation. And I look forward to having Patrick and Hina, having you guys back again, so we can talk, have more discussions on this really important issue. Thank you. And let me turn over to Haipei Shue, UCA president, for closing remarks.
Thanks, Monica. Thank you, Hina and Patrick. Thank you, ACLU, our two great speakers. And when listening to what you guys are talking about, we're just trying to thank God we have ACLU in America. I certainly hope and wish that someday every country in the world will have their own ACLU. Thanks again. I hope this evening will be a great beginning of a strong relationship between our two organizations, because you don't need the rocket science to figure out that in this decade of 2020, there will be, because of the deteriorating relations between China and United States, that you will have many, many cases like this today with constitutional significance from our community. So we'll talk, and we'll come back again, as Monica said, anytime. This evening would be impossible without several key persons here. First, and of course, is Monica. You are indispensable for this success, and I would like to give you a round of virtual applause to you. Hope we can all give you something. And also tonight, we would like to thank Professor Stephen Pei. You don't see him on this, and Professor Chang-Fu Chang and Shirley Mar. It is, I have to say that it is a unique phenomena at UCA that usually we have a PhD people doing some lowly manual work. Sorry, and thanks again. I also noticed earlier that Professor Xiaoxing Shi is here in the audience. And Xiaoxing, thank you for being here with us tonight. We feel your presence here. I want to end by bringing up quickly another topic, and this is extraordinary time, and that we need extraordinary people giving us extraordinary help and the participation from our community. Whatever you can do and give will be greatly appreciated. So join UCA, contact us, and join the cause and the movement. We shall overcome only when we are together. My last word here is this. There are just only a few days left before we can fill up the census form and go to register as a voter. Please do that, please do. Our community, Chinese American community, has the lowest rate of voter registration and the voter turnout. Not one of the lowest, but the lowest. I don't mind just showing off some dirty laundry here. So please register. Okay, enough from me, and thank you for your time, and good evening. Back to Monica.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining the second UCA Town Hall webinar, and please look forward to our next webinar for the next month. So we will make an announcement. Thank you again to everybody, and thank you to our speakers and our volunteer Zoom operators. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.